that I don't accept that the Orthodox claim is compelling to be the church that has maintained true apostolic doctrine. And I think issues like the filioque and the veneration of icons would be examples of where I don't think the Orthodox are right to say we're the mothership and they left us. I think things like the veneration of icons, gosh, I need to put it as strong as I think all the evidence in the first 300 years of church history goes through use of religious imagery, but not veneration. And so that's the first point, is we have to say who's right and who's wrong when there's a split.
But let's just stick with aniconism within the first 3 centuries, because that's what you posted with. There's no Iconodulia in the first 3 centuries. And I would actually wager you this: the only explicit evidence we do have is that they were actually venerated in the first 3 centuries. So, for example, Tertullian complains about idol makers and whatnot making images, but he also makes the complaint that there's I forget the passage, because again, this is not like a formal debate. We have all our sources, but he complains when he's talking about the shepherd of Hermas that they will put a shepherd figure representing Christ on the chalice and he considers that an idol. And he says that they're being whores and adulterers for doing such a thing. But what we're seeing is he's considered idolatry the fact that they are actually using the image of Christ on the most sacred of religious objects. And so this is consistent with Iconodulia. The only archaeological evidence we have of an icon that's that early is the grotto in Jerusalem. And it explicitly says that under this image, we venerate M. And so it actually explicitly details how the image was used for veneration. We have Eusebius Caesarea, who's not a saint, who talks about a statue that was alleged to be made by, I think, the hemorrhaging women. And these gourds grew and they worked miracles. So it's a kind of odd story. But he speaks that the image was venerated. And so even that we have some sources that are actually contrary to the practice, if we listen to what they literally say, they're saying these things were used for veneration. You have, for example, St. Epiphanius, who's usually used as evidence that the early church did not venerate icons. But the quote St. Epiphanius, he said that in his resistance icons that no one listened to him, in fact, only a few. And then he actually gives the explanation they gave for venerated icons, that they don't worship them, but they venerate them in their honor. And so we actually see Iconodulia to be the explicit teaching of what the majority of Christians believed if we just go by historical sources. And so to say, well, those sources don't convince me enough, fair enough. You could be a skeptic, I suppose, but they're the only explicit evidence we have. And so if we got to put a gun to our head and guess based on the only evidence we have, it's in favor of Iconodulia, not aniconism. So that would be my response to point number one.
I'll speak to icons and then I'll speak to 1 Corinthians. Icons, it's probably too much for us to parse all of this, but I would just state summatively my disagreement that there's a good case for icons among the early fathers. If people want to look into this, Paul Alexander has a good book where he reviews especially the 2nd century sources, but also 1st century, 3rd century. And I would just summatively say in Origen and Lactantius, even later people later on, it's not only the case that the early Christians are against the veneration of icons, some of them are against any use of icons. It's seen to be a distinctive hallmark way you tell Christian worship from pagan worship. And I think the historical record is very clear on that point.
But I feel that, not saying you were intending to do this, but what you said sounded like an appeal to authority. I think when we really read Origen in sufficient detail and others, what we're not seeing is them saying the difference between Christians and everyone else is, for example, that everyone else worships these images and venerates these images and Christians don't. To use Origen as an example, Origen says Christians don't have altars and images, right? Now, if we took that literally as the aniconist view would demand, then that means there are actually no altars in churches, which would actually not only contradict 1st century archaeological evidence. We actually have in Pompeii a Christian altar, but it would contradict the word altar being used by St. Ignatius, the word altar in Hebrews chapter 13. I don't think any historian seriously argues that we're not Christian altars. And so if we already know what Origen was saying was not, well, he didn't mean literally Christians don't have altars. He just means they don't have pagan altars for pagan deities. Well, then in the same breath, he's saying images. He's not saying there's no images venerated. He's saying they don't venerate foreign gods. And so I really feel if we take what's explicit, what we actually go with the explicit evidence from the first 3 centuries, all we have is actual veneration of icons. And this is, I think, very damaging to the aniconist inference, because they take an inference and place it above the explicit, documented, and archaeological evidence that we have historically.
Okay, just my brief summative comments are, I'll leave off responding about icons right now.